to introduce Pam, and I'll speak to you later. Bye. Off you go.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Pam Baxter, and I work as Research Governance Specialist, and I also act as the sponsor's representative for the university regarding applications to the Health Research Authority. I'm based up in the medical school, but I obviously come down to main campus whenever I'm needed. So if any of you are local and you do want to sort of meet up over the next sort of few months, do feel that you can contact me. I hope you can see the whole of that slide there. I have got my email address on there, and obviously you will have access to this presentation after I have finished. Doesn't seem to be moving down. Maybe.
What do you want to do?
Slight technical problem. I can't get to the next slide. Just
use that.
It won't.
That one.
Oh, okay. Slight technical problem here. Just bear with us for a second while we get to the next slide. All right. I thought it might be helpful for you to just have a bit of an overview of what the presentation covers. It is quite a long presentation, and yet we're really only touching on some of the aspects that we need to go through today. I will do a few slides about the University of Plymouth's ethics policy, and that policy is for staff and research students. Then I will cover a small amount about confidentiality and maintaining study information, data protection and consent issues, and also the ethical review and committees that you could come across through your research project as you move forwards, and what you need to do regarding applying for university research ethical committee review. I'll also be covering a small introduction to the Health Research Authority application process, which is the part that you might have heard has become a little bit burdensome for some of the students. I will also talk about the Integrated Research Application System, which most of you might have heard of as IRAS, and also mentioning the Data Protection Act and Caldecott principles, which come into effect if you are working within the NHS. The other important thing to mention is the EU General Data Protection Regulations, which will come in next year, because what that means is we will have to actually start to evidence that we are ready for the new regulations that come in with the way that we are doing our consent areas as we move forward. So I will talk about that as well. So just to start with, the University Research Ethics Policy. The university is committed to maintaining and promoting the highest standards of integrity and probity in scientific research. And there are also presentations available that you can attend at the university regarding research integrity that are run by one of my colleagues, Angela Pello. The ethical values are central to our structures and practices of research governance. And what I've done is put the actual link so that you can find where that policy is, because I don't know how easy you find it to navigate through our university web pages, but it seems to get more and more complicated to track down certain pieces of information that you need. So attention to the ethical implications of our research for research subjects, researchers and the research sponsor is an intrinsic part of good research practice, and it's something that you all need to be thinking about as you're planning your research. The university has an established set of fundamental principles to ensure good scientific practice as well, and the integrity of the research involving human participants. We also cover research involving animal subjects and general principles of data confidentiality and access. So if you were applying to the Faculty of Health and Human Sciences Research Ethics Committee, I've taken some of the text actually from the website, so this would be as you would see it, or it might be as it appears in some of the forms that they use. So in most cases, approval should be sought individually for each project, which will obviously be the case for each of you as you move forward. There are areas where you can have programme approval that's granted for the research that comprises of an ongoing set of studies or investigations that utilise the same methods and methodology, but where the precise number and timing of such studies cannot be specified in advance. And you may be asked to participate in one of these programs with other colleagues, staff members that are doing a piece of research, and you may be acting to sort of have input to that piece of research whilst you're doing your degree as well. That's generally more appropriate if you were doing a PhD study, but at MSc level, you would generally be judged as an individual project. So the project outline for the proposed research, normally this is around 2,000 words for your application to the Faculty Ethics Committee, but it should be sufficient to enable the committee to have a really clear understanding of what the project is about. So the project outline, this is really just a very quick overview of what is expected, and these are really important areas that you need to really hone your work down to. So your research questions and the things that you're thinking about now, you need to be thinking about how you're actually going to explain that, not only to the ethical reviewers, but also your potential participants that you might be seeing. So the background of the research really should be situating the study within its research area, including references and, where appropriate, within the relevant policies and practice developments that may be in place for your area of work, and also within your own professional agendas. So the aim and the key questions are really very important. You do need to make sure that you have one really good aim that you want to sort of find out from your piece of research. It should be stated clearly, including how the researcher anticipates their fulfillment, will move forward knowledge, and, where appropriate, policy or practice. Now, recruitment of participants is something that's very often underestimated. We think that we can just go and do something, but really the where and the how the participants will be recruited is a very important area. When you're doing your research at master's level, you do need to have the use of a gatekeeper, so that the first point of contact you would have with participants is not generally from you yourself as the researcher. Generally that is because you either have a role where you may come across some of the participants, so you may be in a clinical role and you might want to do research within your area, so either with a patient group or maybe staff that are working within your team. But what they don't want is for you to abuse that privilege of access to those participants. And so by using a gatekeeper, which can be either a senior administrator or a unit manager that can just put forward the information about your study, it just helps that first point of contact and put the information across about your study. And then the participants can contact you and express their interest to take part in your study. And once you have consented them, then basically you can carry on and do whatever you need to do for your research. You do also need to think about any inclusion or exclusion criteria that is relevant to your study, and also justify the sample size. With qualitative research, obviously you're not looking in a statistical sense, but really just making sure that it's a manageable project for you to do. And my general recommendation is, if you were doing interviews, that you would probably only interview no more than, say, 10 to 12 people, because you have to think about transcribing the interview that you've recorded, and that's generally quite a lot of work. So another area, really, obviously the most important, is the methodology, and the application should contain a clear outline of the methodology, including both the data collection and data analysis processes. And I can't emphasize that enough on really making clear how you're going to do that, how you're going to protect data, and how you can ensure confidentiality of any personal data that you may need to get your study going. So the methodology should also be a description, including references of the particular methodology being used and how it will be employed in relation to the study, and which techniques of analysis will be used once the data is collected, and how this will be applied to the particular data set. Another area that is really fundamental to the way that the university operates is research integrity, as I touched on earlier in the presentation. And there are two key areas to that. The first is honesty in research, and the second one is openness. So at the heart of all research endeavour, regardless of the discipline or the institution that you're in, is the need for the researcher to be honest in respect of their own actions in the research and in their responses to the actions of other researchers. This applies to the whole range of research, including experimental design, generating and analysing data, publishing results, and acknowledging the direct and indirect contributions of colleagues and collaborators and others. But one thing I do need to point out is that university personnel must refrain from plagiarism, piracy, or the fabrication of results. And if any instances of such acts will be taken most seriously, and the relevant university disciplinary procedure will be invoked if appropriate. So, along with the honesty, we also need to make sure that we express openness in the way that we conduct our research. And while recognising the need for researchers to protect their own research interests in the process of planning their research and obtaining their results, the university encourages researchers to be as open as possible in discussing their work with other researchers and with the public. I often get asked whether it's okay to talk to participant groups to get an idea about how a researcher should conduct their research and whether they need ethical approval to do that. It is actually quite okay to talk to a participant group. If you know a focus group that is meeting, you can talk generally to them and get a general consensus of opinion on your research plan and what you would like to do, and put that towards the way that you design your research, but you don't need ethical approval to do that. Obviously, if you then started to want to record any information, then that would, of course, need ethical review. But regarding the openness, once the results have been published and where appropriate, the university expects the researchers to make available relevant data and materials to others on request. And one of the things that I have been informed is that the university does offer you the opportunity to put your research in a research database called Pearl. And so that has been part of the university's open access policy that is in line with Research Councils UK, and it does enable you to explain to your ethical reviewers that you can use a research database to register your research. So in addition, the university expects researchers to observe any appropriate standards of practice that are set out in the guidelines published by funding bodies, scientific societies, and other relevant professional bodies. But this is also appropriate if you are working on a study where there has been some funding and you do need to make sure that your study falls within the remit of the terms and conditions of that funding body. So these are quite important points to note. So just a summary of the main issues then that you will be needing for your application to the Faculty of Health. Mentioned and touched on the purpose and design of your study. We've talked a little bit about recruitment and inclusion and exclusion. Consent is a very sort of challenging area often for most people to sort of get through, but on this site I think I have actually provided a consent template and a participant information form that is used by the Health Research Authority, but there's no reason why you can't use those and adapt those, even if you only need to go through the faculty, the university application process. You do also need to think about the risks, burdens and benefits that there are to potential participants. And so things like conducting a 1-hour interview can actually be quite stressful for some participants and may make them feel a little bit stressed or a little bit upset if you are the first person that they really managed to talk to about an area that they are concerned about or care about. That comes into effect probably more frequently in the types of psychology studies that are done. But you do need to think about those sorts of burdens and benefits that participants might have. Another burden could be potentially if you were seeing a participant at a normal standard care visit, but then you wanted to ask them to come to an additional visit. So that is a burden because then they have to make additional travel arrangements, and very often you don't have the funding to support travel costs for them to come and take part in your research study. Confidentiality obviously is highly important, and I have later on in the presentation got the full details of the 8 Data Protection Act principles and the Caldecott principles. There are now 7 principles which I will show you as I go forward. Another important area to think about is conflict of interest. And that comes back to, as I've mentioned just a little bit earlier, if you were doing a study involving a patient group that you might normally see as part of your care in a clinical role, a conflict of interest would be seen that you could be making those participants feel obliged to take part just because they know you. The same happens if you're also doing research on other students or other members of staff within your team, where they might just feel obliged to take part because they don't want to upset you. So you do really need to think about that and how you word your application to ensure that you're demonstrating that there is no potential conflict of interest. All participants have a right to withdraw and to complain, so you do need to make that clear as well in your application. And a participant can withdraw at any time. There are no restrictions to that. Also use the tissue samples where it applies, but I don't think with your group there'll be anybody that would necessarily be doing any work with tissue samples. And I've just put in a little extra bit there about getting ready for the new EU General Data Protection Regulations in 2018. And there are a few links on there that might be quite useful. The first one is the Health Research Authorities link, and then there's one that relates to sort of ethics guidance that has been sort of going for many years now, and I think that's still active. But also the last one is the decision toolkit, so that's a really useful website as well, but again I will talk about that a little bit further on. So just to understand about student research, if your study is below doctoral level, then and it is seen as part of an educational qualification, the academic supervisor will take on the role of chief investigator. But where acting as the chief investigator, the academic supervisor should sign both the chief investigator and supervisor declarations for the research when you're applying through the NHS. And then with doctoral students, it's normally expected that if you're undertaking the project as a doctoral student, you will be named as the chief investigator rather than the academic supervisor, although you obviously still need your academic supervisor. However, in some cases, it may be more appropriate for a clinical supervisor to take on the role of chief investigator for a project undertaken by a doctoral student. This is more common within an NHS organisation, where it may be more appropriate, and particularly if you're at a distance and you have more contact with a clinical supervisor that can act on your behalf for your study. And hopefully none of you will be involved in studies that involve investigational medicinal products, which you shouldn't be doing at this level. So the other part about student participation in other studies is that where the student is participating in a project that is not purely educational, the chief investigator may be another experienced researcher, such as a health professional or academic researcher. And also ethical review of student research. There's a huge amount of guidance which is available on the Health Research Authority website, which is this link at the bottom. And it also provides guidance for your supervisors as well, and it's really quite helpful for you to sort of take a look at that if you want to. It's not necessarily that easy to navigate because there is so much information on the site that when you think you've gone to a part that you want to find out about, it might take you off on another route in a different tangent. But do let me know if you get any problems at all, and I'm more than happy to sort of help you through the way to get through the site. So definitely need to talk about confidentiality and how you're going to maintain your study information. So this means keeping any means of communication secure. So whether that's by, if you're actually going to record information, so for an audio recording of an interview, or whether you're using email communication as well, you do need to make sure that you're using the most secure means. That you can do by using encrypted devices or encrypting documents, but obviously the only thing to then be aware of is that if you do encrypt a document or you have an encrypted device, that you do need to make sure you know the password, because it will not be able to be retrieved if you cannot find your password. If you're keeping any paper documents, which you may do if you're getting signed consent forms from participants, you do need to keep them in locked filing cabinets. And when you're doing your application, it's quite okay to just say that you'll keep the documents in a locked filing cabinet on a secure premises, which will either be university or NHS premises. You don't need to go down to the actual detail of which office and which building, because in a way that's almost as bad as not protecting the data, because if you're too explicit, it's almost giving it away. The other thing you need to make sure is that you switch off or you lock your computer, so you just do the Control-Alt-Delete so that you can lock your computer if you're holding personal data about individuals, and you leave the room and leave your computer running while you're out of the room. And you must ensure that that information is not displayed on screen or readable on a desk or even in an in-tray when others are in the room. So it really is a case of protecting that information and respecting it, and thinking about how you would feel yourself if your information was left lying around where other people could see it. So do respect that. The other part is about using secure disposal for your research study. Once you've finished and any of your pieces of paper that you need to get rid of, you must make sure that you use a confidential shredding system. There are systems available within the university and presumably wherever you are placed. You just need to locate which is the actual confidential shredding service that your organisation or area uses. And also, great care must be taken when you're transferring data to make sure that it's undertaken securely. Dropbox is not secure, and if you need any help with using the most efficient means of transferring information, then I would suggest you talk to the IT guys who can help you. There is another system called Box, which you will have information about when you go through your application form to the Faculty of Health, and it gives you complete details of how you set it up, how you store your information, and that is quite secure. The university has gone over to Office 365 and it is offering web-based storage facilities which are now more secure. But again, I would suggest that you talk to the IT guys because they're the ones that will know how secure it is. But ideally, you shouldn't be transferring any personal information to anywhere where you are then putting that information at risk. So only use the most secure mechanisms. So these are some of the questions that you can ask yourself when you're handling research data. Do you need to record this data? Now that means really that you only record the data that you really want to conduct your study. Don't just collect it because you think it might be a good idea. It really does need to be for a purpose. And don't, think, yes, it's fine. Oh, I might as well do that while I'm here. I'll just collect this other bit of information. If you have no use for it, then don't collect it. So it's really being respectful of the way that you're gathering that information. The other thing you need to really be aware of is, does this data subject know that the data is held and for what reason? So that's where your information sheet comes in, and making sure that you've made that information really clear about what you're going to do about collecting the data, how you're going to store it, and what you will do when the study comes to an end and how you will dispose of it. So if the data is sensitive, you need to know that a formal consent for the data and access to that data, and that the data subject has actually consented to it, and that you've actually obtained that consent from the data subject. If the consent of the data subject is implicit, implied, so they know that they're pretty sure they know what they're doing, and you're satisfied that the processing of the data is in their best interests, these are really the best methods to follow. Make sure the data is accurate and how it can be checked, so that you've got some of the mechanism to make sure that you are really collecting the most up-to-date data and that it's pertinent to your study. Make sure the data held is in a secure location such that no one else will be able to access it without authorization. So that is, again, going back to using encrypted software, making sure it's in a locked office or a locked filing cabinet. And it's very difficult today with the technology that we have available. Don't be tempted to use things like your phone to store data. I have had instances where people have said they were going to record interviews on a phone, but really if you can use some other device, it's probably better, because you should not be using a personal phone for doing work to do with your research project. Also think about how long you need to keep the data. At the moment, the university policy is 10 years. In that, it means they will keep it up to 10 years if necessary. But if you really feel there is no need to keep the data for longer than, say, 3 years or 5 years, then you can actually stipulate that making it quite clear that the university policy is at the moment that it will keep it up to 10 years if necessary. But you do need to make sure that there will be somebody that could act as a custodian should you be moving on and doing another job as you sort of progress through your careers. Also make sure, again, reiterating that there's a mechanism for securely disposing of the data. That's not only the paper documentation that I've talked about before and using shredding machines and the correct confidential bins for disposing of data, but also making sure that if you're storing any electronic data on your computer, that it is securely destroyed at the end of the study or when you've actually finished it and you've made an arrangement with whoever will act as custodian. Generally, that can either be your academic supervisor or someone who would act as chief investigator within a clinical role, but it really needs to be decided before you sort of start your study. I need to now mention about anonymisation, because we all very blithely say, oh, we'll anonymise the data, but a lot of people don't actually look at the information that goes behind that. Now, within the Data Protection Act, the Information Commissioner's Office are the people that really describe the way that we should be handling, looking at data, collecting data, what we can collect and can't collect, and they do have a code of practice specifically about anonymisation. It is about 130 pages long, so I'm not expecting you to read it all, but the Information Commissioner's Office website is really useful, and if you have further queries beyond anything that I talk about today or any other information that I provide with you as you go through your research projects, then it is a really good resource and definitely worth looking at. So the code explains the issues around anonymisation of personal data and the disclosure of data once it has been anonymised. It also explains the relevant legal concepts and tests in the Data Protection Act, and the code provides good practice advice that will be relevant to all organisations that need to convert personal data into a form in which individuals are no longer identifiable. We use the term anonymised data to refer to data that does not itself identify any individual and that is unlikely to allow any individual to be identified through its combination with other data. So generally the advice is, once you have secured who your participants are going to be, you use unique identifiers for that participant from the earliest opportunity. So even if you were doing a recording of an interview, I would suggest that you talk to your participant before you start doing the interview and explain about how important it is to you that you want to protect their data, and that for the purposes of the interview you will allocate a personal unique identifier for them to take part in the study. And you can also encourage them not to refer to people by name when they're in their conversation with you, just to help you when you actually come to transcribing your data. I do believe there are sophisticated devices that can encrypt your recordings almost as you're doing them, but that is again something that you can look into with the IT specialists. So the Information Commissioner's Office Anonymisation Code of Practice is actually for any organisation that needs or wants to turn personal data into anonymised data, and they should use the Code of Practice. And this could be, for example, because the organisation is required by law to publish anonymised data, such as some health service bodies. So, for example, things like public health bodies or NHS England can provide information looking at sort of health sort of standards of care and things like waiting lists and targets that go on within the NHS, and they can supply information that is anonymised and can be used as sort of secondary data for research studies. But also the code deals with the request for information that contains third-party personal data made under the Freedom of Information Act. So all organisations have somebody that is responsible for Freedom of Information Act requests, and we have somebody in the university here who also looks after data protection, and that is Emma Wainman. And they have to look at any application that is made and work out how to get the information together and make sure that it's in a suitable state for the person that has requested that information. It also makes itself more transparent and accountable to the public, or intends to further, research and statistical purposes by making the anonymised data available to researchers. So a lot of councils use the code of practice on how they can anonymise data with the information that they collect, and there's a whole range of bodies that need to think about how they're going to use the code of practice. So we're now going to just move on to the types of research committees that there are, research ethics committees. So we have the University Faculty Research Ethics Committee, the National Research Ethics Service for research involving NHS patients or premises and or social care subjects can now be accessed via the Health Research Authority. There are also the Home Office, which look after any research involving animals, and also independent review boards. Generally, those are external, and if you're doing international research, there will either be an international review board, and the international research that happens where the overseas sponsors are required to appoint a legal representative depending on the type of study. But hopefully all of you will either be able to go through the Faculty Research Ethics Committee or a combination of both with the Health Research Authority. And that is where I've come in to help you with getting through the Health Research Authority process. So the guidance and process through the University Ethics is that as I've mentioned before, the University Research Ethics Policy was updated in 2013, not only to incorporate the University Ethics Policy, it also incorporated part of the good research practice that used to be in existence. But it was brought up to date to come in line with the Researcher Code of Conduct and also to comply with the Concordat to support research integrity, which came out in 2012. And the Concordat to support research integrity was developed by the medical research councils, the Universities UK, National Health, and also other research councils. There's also the Faculty Research Ethics Committee, and they develop the local policies and procedures to consider individual proposals relevant to the faculty. And then the University Research Ethics Committee itself oversees all of the faculty research ethics committees, so it doesn't matter which faculty that is of the university, and each faculty has to report back to the university committee. But they don't actually review any applications, they just oversee what happens within the faculties and ensure that they're following all of the reporting guidelines. So ethical review and committees, I've put the link there because again it is quite buried within the website if you're trying to look for those pages. And what I'd like to sort of put across is it does mention the close regard for ethical implications of research on subjects and the wider public by researchers and research sponsors is intrinsic to good research practice. So the university committees apply the fundamental principles outlined in the ethics policy, as I've mentioned, and when approving and advising on projects for research by university staff and students. So the information on how to apply for staff is on the web page there on that link, and it mentions internal staff are to contact the appropriate faculty committee administrator first for further advice and to inform them of your intention to submit an application. And the individual faculty forms, the review forms and specific guidance can be found at that link. And I would urge you to contact the administrator just to make sure you have the most up-to-date version of the form, because with the way that it is changing within the NHS, we're frequently having to update the form and make sure that the information is up to date. So research within the NHS and social care subjects is approved by the Health Research Authority via the IRAS form application to obtain HRA approval. And the outcome of the HRA approval decisions must be reported to the relevant University Faculty Ethics Committee as well. I've just cut and pasted the actual section that shows the Faculty of Health and Human Sciences, which also shows the Psychology Subcommittee and the Health Student Subcommittee. I haven't changed who is the chair of the actual Faculty of Health. I believe it is Yaniv Hanek now. Michael Shepard has now stood down as chair, and Sylvia Turbeck has taken over from Graham Williamson as the Student Subcommittee chair. So there are the details of Sarah C. Jones. She has got C. Jones there because Sarah Jones is actually the head of finance, so you do need to make sure you get the right email address, otherwise finance will be wondering why you're sending your application in. And on that link there, I hope that works from either the presentation that you will have access to, or if you go into the webpage, you can see the link there. It says more information. It should be shown as a hyperlink, and you can access the forms. But obviously, if your study is NHS based, then please contact me and I will be able to help you through the process. It is quite a laborious process, so I would urge you to allow plenty of time with your application and start sort of thinking about how you're going to work on it and bring the information together. So it's planning ahead is the key. So research within the NHS and social care. This has now changed because of the Health Research Authority. So research with the NHS and social care is now reviewed and assessed and approved by the Health Research Authority programme to attain HRA approval. Some studies do not require ethical approval via the UK Health Departments, which is the old NRES that is still in existence, but it now comes under the umbrella of the Health Research Authority. And an example of that is if you were going to do your research on NHS staff. However, studies that meet that exclusion criteria will need a full ethical review via the University Faculty Ethics Committee and will still require assessment by the Health Research Authority in order to obtain HRA approval. That does mean you will be filling out two forms. So you will have to fill out the IRAS form to get your assessment done by the HRA, and you will need to fill out the university form in order to get your ethical aspects of your study approved by the university. So please note that the outcome of all HRA decisions must be reported to the relevant university committee for their ethical review or chair's action. So the bonus is if you've had to fill out the IRAS application form and you've gone through the actual ethical review with the Health Research Authority, your study is then eligible just to receive chair's action. So they would use some of your documents that you've used for your IRAS application, and then that would just be signed off by the chair. But obviously, if you haven't had to have it reviewed ethically by the HRA, then it will go through the full approval process. So as I've mentioned before, there are my details saying that if you need assistance with your HRA applications, which you undoubtedly will, I can provide more information about research passports, and that basically is just directing you to the compliance team within the Faculty of Health and just saying whether you will need a research passport or not. That generally is usually if you haven't got an honorary contract with the NHS or a full substantive contract with the NHS and you require access to other multiple sites. So is it research? We're all hoping that you do undertake a research study, but not all projects undertaken within the NHS are classed as research. And under the Research Governance Framework, projects not classified as research are not managed as research within the NHS. So what that means is that they do not require ethical approval by the Research Ethics Committee in the NHS, so through the HRA service. They don't require approval from NHS R&D offices necessarily, but they may require some other form of approval from the organisation undertaking or hosting the project, depending on local arrangements. So I've put some useful links there so that you can really make sure that you are doing your piece of research. There's the leaflet that is defining research that has been reviewed and revised several times over the last few years. And what I don't really want to find out is that you are trying to do a study that doesn't need to go through the Health Research Authority process just because it's quite a cumbersome process to go through, and that you try and do a service evaluation or something similar. That doesn't mean to say that your project couldn't be mainly relating to service evaluation, but if it is, then it will mean that we need to involve other people within the NHS organisation that you're going to, which may mean sort of talking to information governance people as well as the R&D offices. I think it's always a courtesy to let the R&D office know, even if you are doing a lower level study that doesn't go through the whole rigorous process of review. So non-NHS detail from the website, it does say that most universities have established research ethics committees as part of their internal governance arrangements, which we do, as we've talked about the faculty ethics committees already. And these research ethics committees are not part of the National Research Ethics Service. And in most cases where the research meets the criteria for requiring ethical review within the governance arrangements for research ethics committees, which is locally called GAFREC, then universities will not also require review by their internal ethics committee. However, all students and researchers employed by universities must check their university's internal policies. And our policy is that you do have to submit your application to the Faculty Ethics Committee, even if you've been through the whole HRA approval process. And specific guidance for social care research is available through the Social Care Research Ethics Committee coordinators. And there is a link there to the HRA's website that talks about before you apply and non-NHS recs for higher education institutions. So how are non-research activities covered? So organisations like the University of Plymouth do adopt a systematic approach to dealing with these types of studies and how these borderline activities are dealt with. And the aim is that an integrated data set of processes for managing risk, which encourages greater openness about these activities and builds up a consistent case law on which to base future decisions rather than relying on ad hoc responses. Often this is completed in collaboration with other relevant departments, as I touched on just a moment ago, like clinical governance, risk governance, information governance, and where those persons with the experience in those areas decide whether the proposal is to be treated as research and or whether other governance systems apply to it. A lot of observational studies sometimes fall within that area, but you do need to think about how you're actually going to go about that observational study and who else might be within the room at the time, and very often they still need to be reviewed by an NHS version of an ethics review panel. So this is just a really brief overview on the National Research Ethics Service Board, and it just defines the difference between research, clinical audit and service evaluation. So that obviously research addresses clearly defined questions, aims and objectives, which I'm sure you're all coming up with already, which will be really good. Clinical audit measures against a standard, so that's looking back at something that's already happened and you're measuring back against something that has already been used. And service evaluation measures against current service without reference to a standard. So it's actually more of an active piece of research. So when you're applying for your Research Ethics Committee approval, the core information that you require is a well-formed protocol. And I do have a template that the HRA provides, a qualitative template, and they only supply a clinical trials template. Unfortunately, there's nothing in between, but generally the qualitative template is adaptable and you can take from it what you need for your study. Your academic review will be provided by your academic supervisor, and that can be just based on your protocol, proposal or your assessment, but that will need to be submitted if you're applying to the Health Research Authority. Sponsorship is very easy because that comes via the university if you're a student of the university, and I act as the sponsor's representative on behalf of applications going through to the Health Research Authority. So I'm the person that you need to get to sign off your IRAS form as sponsor and also the protocol. Proof of indemnity arrangements are very straightforward. They're provided by the University for Student Research, and if you actually just go onto the university website and type in insurance, the first link that comes up is the pages to the procurement section of the university, where all of the certificates are available there for you to download that you might need. But generally you'd probably only need professional indemnity or public liability, depending on the type of study that you were doing. You will need obviously your application forms, which we've talked about, and part of that will be sometimes using an invitation letter, which is useful for student-based research, information sheet or sheets, which means that you will need a separate version for each type of sample group that you will be using. So if you were using doing a study where you were interviewing parents and their children, the parents would need a version and the children would need a version. And the same goes for the consent forms. Obviously, consent forms are not required for questionnaires because generally the return of a questionnaire is deemed as assent, but you will need a consent form, and I have supplied a template which you will have access to, and I do urge you to follow the guidance within that template and the wording that is used. And also you do need to initial boxes with consent forms, not just ask people to tick boxes. So that is something you need to bear in mind. You only need to produce a GP letter if the study affects or influences the standard care of that patient, if you are interviewing patients or seeing patients as part of your study. And that's just something that you also need to ask consent for from participants, that you can contact their GP. Questionnaires, you can use a whole range of questionnaires. You can develop your own questionnaires if it's relevant to your study type, or you can use validated questionnaires as well, which happens a lot with the psychology studies, where you may have a whole range of questionnaires that you would like your participant to complete. And also any posters or advertisements that you want to use for your study, they have to be submitted so that they can be checked for suitability. So ethical review of research involving the NHS needs to comply at the moment with the Research Governance Framework for Health and Social Care, but that has been, after a recent consultation, the Research Governance Framework has been reviewed by the Health Research Authority, and it has now been replaced by the UK Policy Framework for Health and Social Care, which the HRA are using as their basis for assessment when they're looking at studies and making sure that it complies with the new UK policy. So the Health Research Authority has also reviewed the research application process, which is where it has made it more burdensome for our students, as I've mentioned before, where you're actually having to fill in sometimes 2 forms for your application for ethical review. But that came in on the 1st of April last year, and it does provide a single checking mechanism for both the ethical and governance approval prior to the sign-off at local level. And this is done through the Health Research Authority approval programme. The benefit to that does mean that once you have got your approval through the HRA, that you can run your study in any part of England, and you can go to the devolved nations, but unfortunately they're still using the old system, so it may mean a mixture of both systems being applied, but I will help you with that, so there's no need to be concerned about that. There's no struggle involved. It's all done with collaboration with the Health Research Authority. So if the research involves the NHS or research within another non-NHS area, it still requires an independent research ethics committee review. And if your study involves NHS staff, you will require HRA assessment to obtain your HRA approval, and as I mentioned before, your university faculty ethical review, plus subsequent approval from the NHS trust in which the research is intended to take place. And they have changed what was called R&D approval to capacity and capability approval. But depending on what level of approval is required in the local trust, it will depend how much contact you have with the R&D department. But it is all managed through the HRA process. So all non-NHS research requires an independent review. And although you would need to go through the faculty review, that also means that if you were doing a study in another area, that say something like a hospice or a charity-based organisation, that you will need to have some form of approval from that organisation that they are happy for you to conduct your research in their organisation. For all other research, it would obviously go via an independent review board or committee relevant to that area. And that, as I've mentioned before, is the case for international research. So changes since the 1st of April last year. Here is the link to the Health Research Authority website, and it states that quick links to our committees for research ethics, gene therapy and confidentiality. Please make sure you're familiar with the content for the research community webpage guidance before applying. I have actually put together a sponsors key tips, which does have a lot of the links from the HRA website, and I felt that it was necessary to do that due to the difficulty of navigating the website, and also because of other areas, general sticking points that I've found that students come across. So I've put that together in a document which I think is also available to you after the presentation. So the responsibilities of the Health Research Authority, they're actually now responsible for the research ethics committees in England as part of a UK-wide system, and for the confidentiality advisory group. So that covers all things under section 251 approval in England and Wales. And that relates to sort of getting approval for studies without consent. So if you were wanting to look back at information and those participants obviously don't know that you wanted to conduct research on their data or their information, and you may need help through the confidentiality advisory group. That used to be the National Information Governance Board, and prior to that, the Patient Information and Advisory Group. So it's all now come within one organisation and under the Health Research Authority. And that was done through legislation linked in with the CARE Act of 2014, which allows the HRA to give a broader remit and it enables them to streamline the regulatory system and make it easier to do good research. I know that some of you don't find it very easy going through the system, but I am here to help, so don't worry. This is the most simplified diagram I can show you of how it works. So your application is received, and if it goes through their ethical review through the HRA, it sort of goes off to one side, and also the study is sort of sent through the assessment process, and then at the end they collate the approvals together before you get your HRA approval. Obviously you can follow down that system where you've put your application in, it goes to the initial assessment, and then the HRA assessment through to HRA approval if the HRA are not actually doing the ethical component of your review. So here's the link to the research community web pages of the HRA. It provides guidance for applicants and the research community for the full research pathway from the initial study idea to publication and dissemination of results at the end of the study. So it is really useful, and there's a huge amount of information on that website. So do take a look at it and see if, you know, find your way around it, get used to navigating around it, and it is a really useful tool. But the regulation of health research provides participants with the assurance that the research they take part in is of high quality, safe and ethical. It also ensures that the results of research can be relied on and used as evidence to inform future decisions about healthcare. Sorry, I've just noticed there's a question there. And also that the UK has a range of bodies which have roles in regulating different aspects of health research in humans. The Health Research Authority works with these bodies to coordinate an overall system for regulation and governance of research. So I'm just going to stop for a moment to have a look at the question. So somebody has asked if I can clarify the difference between research on patients versus staff. Both need to fill out the IRAS form, but only reviewed by NRES if patients are involved. Does that change how the researcher fills out the form at all? Actually, it does mean you do have to fill out the IRAS form, whether it is for staff or for patients. But if you filled out the form for patients, it would go through the ethical review through the Health Research Authority using the IRAS form, but you still need to fill in the IRAS form, even if the study is only on staff, in order to get the assessment process done by the Health Research Authority. And there's a second question that says, if participants are NHS staff employed by the university, do I still need to go through HRA or just the FREC? So basically, it's the same answer. So if your participants are NHS staff, you still need to fill in the IRAS application. You still need to go through the Health Research Authority in order to get the assessment done, but you still need to go through the university to the faculty to get your ethical review of the study. And then another question saying, thank you for the presentation. If I'm planning to interview healthcare providers, who undertakes treatment escalation form completion? Would I be able to approach GPs of current clients about research ideas, research methods before I undertake it in a broad sense? Yes, Dawn, that's correct. You can actually talk to patients within the surgery if you're sort of placed with health providers. You can talk to them about, you tell them about your research idea and what you want to do in a very broad sense, as you've mentioned, and you can get their input, get a general consensus of opinion on what they feel about the study, and you can often get some really useful tips on, sort of things that you need to change. You can show them even an outline of a potential information sheet and say, this is the information sheet I'd like to use for my research. Do you think there's anything that I need to change in it? And you can do all of that without ethical approval. But the minute you start recording anything, or you want to say that you want to do an interview with a participant, then you would need to have ethical approval in order to do that. Another question coming through saying, how about if my participants are students? Again, it really comes back to making sure you use a gatekeeper to put the information forward about the study that you would like to do, so that you are giving a fair chance for those students to choose whether they want to take part or not, so that they don't feel coerced into doing the study. And that does happen. They just feel obliged to do it because they know you, and so using a gatekeeper is really paramount when you're doing something at master's level or even at PhD level. It's really helpful, and it just enables those people to have that sort of choice over how they do it. So another question is, I work for a local community interest company, not the NHS per se, and my project will be around patients' perceptions of the service offered by the minor injury services. So this would be around service provision but involves patients. An ethical approval is required, I'm assuming. Yes, you're absolutely correct, Diane. You would still need ethical approval. There are so many organisations out there now. Since the PCT's reconfigured, there are a lot of social enterprise organisations, but essentially those patients still need to know that the study that you are asking them to take part in has been ethically reviewed. And I would obviously need to work with you a bit more closely to find out the absolute nitty-gritty about where that is and what you're wanting to do, but it would either be through the IRAS form or just through the faculty, but if those patients are definitely NHS patients, it absolutely definitely goes through the HRA and through the IRAS form application process. Right, so I think that's okay for now. I will carry on so that we can get through the rest of this, and please feel that you can ask questions as we go along. So some useful links there for the Health Research Authority, the before you apply, is it research, a detailed link on the consent and participation information, and the decision tools link as well. On the consent and participant information, you can actually look at style and content, and it will guide you through all of those areas as well, and it will give you really good examples that you can use as a basis to develop your information sheet. So I would encourage you to have a look at that. So the application process for accessing the NHS to conduct your research via IRAS. As I've mentioned, IRAS stands for Integrated Research Application System, and that is the link to get to the system. I do actually run training sessions on how to get yourself set up with the IRAS form, if any of you are local and are able to attend those, and I can provide details if you need that. But essentially it's a single system for applying for the permissions and approvals for health and social care and community care research in the UK, and it enables you to enter the information about your project at one point instead of duplicating information on separate application forms. And that's done through the sort of amalgamated data set of the IRAS system. And it also helps you to meet the regulatory and governance requirements, generally by the way that the questions are asked within the form and the areas that it sort of covers, which are relating to data protection as well, and the way that you're going to undertake your research from start to finish. So the IRAS form captures a huge amount of information, and for several review bodies. I've only highlighted in bold the ones that are probably relevant to you, although it does cover obviously all of those other areas. So what that means is that if you've indicated that that is the type of study that you will be doing, then all of those aspects or parts of the forms will be available to you through the one system. And it's a log-in, log-out system that you have ownership of your own form. So a vital part of the RS form is the checklist, and it might be helpful for you just to look at the checklist, which is available to look at once you get into once you've actually created a project in IRAS. The checklist tells you all of the documents that you might need for your application, so it can just be used as a useful tool. But the thing to really bear in mind is that you must keep the version numbers and dates really clear on your application. And when you're doing your first application, obviously all version numbers will be version 1 when you do your application and you're submitting it. But I do understand, obviously, as you're working through draft application, your application yourself, you might start numbering your versions. But what we don't want to see happen is you submit your version to the ethical reviewers with it as version 14, and then they think, well, where are all of the other versions that go with this project? So it's just remembering to keep it as version 1 on your first submission. And the dates, please keep those consistent across all of your documents. So obviously don't necessarily put the date in as such until you're sort of near to completion, but try and make sure that it is consistent on everything from the protocol right through to information sheets and consent forms. One thing that's actually relevant just at the moment, a question has come through to say, does the length of the IRS form depend on what type of study it is and what level of study, i.e. master's study versus PhD? Educational studies tend to be shorter documents anyway, and that is indicated on the project filter of the IRS form. So it will make the form shorter purely because it ghosts out some of the questions that you would have to fill in if you were not doing an educational study. But it's pretty much the same depending on the type of educational study. The only difference being that if you were doing it as a PhD, you would fill in the form as the chief investigator, but as a master's level, you would fill in the form as the principal investigator with your academic supervisor as the chief investigator. So it just has a few more boxes regarding supervision and who's acting as investigator. So carrying on with the little bit about the information checklist, there are certain documents that are marked as mandatory that must be submitted, and that will be things like a protocol, and they do like you to send in CVs of yourself and your supervisors, and just 2-page CVs, and that there's a template within the RS form which is available to you to complete. But task buttons allow you to add extra documents of the same type, so you can do that by duplicating a row, and also if you've got several versions of information sheets or checklists, consent forms, then you can add extra rows and it will duplicate those rows. For any other documents that don't fit within the detail of the checklist, you can just add additional rows and then you can name the document as appropriate. And also just to point out, electronic authorization is mandatory now for declarations in some of the forms, and that's been the case since 2014. But when you actually get to submit your documents, it's all done electronically, and I would suggest obviously that we're in contact before that point and you don't just go ahead and submit it, because I will have had to have signed the form before you get to that submission stage. And I do just need to make sure that I give you all of the reminders of the bits of documents that you need to put in for that submission to make it a bit easier when you actually get through to the assessment process. So as I mentioned, there's a project filter that dictates about educational projects, and really it just means that you fill in a certain number on the project filter depending on whether you're doing your study as a master's or a PhD. And there is detail on that slide there that shows which question it is. And generally you would complete the application anyway, whether you were doing it as a PhD or an MSc, but it's just the change around the supervision boxes that will be slightly different when you're doing it as a PhD compared to when you're doing it as a master's. So the guidance on information sheets, the information is the most important decision aid, and surveys indicate that those approached to participate want material on which they can make a decision, and that many wish to share that decision with their healthcare professional or members of their family. They do like to ask whether, sort of relatives and friends, whether they feel they should take part in the study. So the information you give is really important, and it must enable them to come to that decision. But the need for trust is still evident, and this process is much more than a provision of an information sheet and a signature on a consent form. And a recent review of evidence indicated, not surprisingly, that talking one-to-one was the most effective way to provide information that was understood. And that is an important part about, sort of giving your information about your study to your potential participants, is that you do need to make sure they've actually read the information before you start. And if they say, oh, I don't need to, I'm afraid you do need to ensure that they do go through it with you, even if it means you almost reading it out to them, just so that you know you've done your level best to get the information across in the best way possible before you actually ask them to consent to take part. And they do need time to ask questions about the study and to reflect about it. There isn't an exact defined time for this, and it just needs to be sort of fit for the purpose of the type of study. And there is sort of talk about, maybe 24 hours is adequate, but that again depends very much on the type of study that you are doing. If you're doing a study within an emergency department, you wouldn't have 24 hours necessarily to get somebody to sort of look through an information sheet and decide whether they want to take part in the study. So there are always exceptions, but it's just making sure that it's relevant and that they've had time to really think about it and whether they want to take part, and that they don't feel coerced into taking part. That is really important. It does also help if you can, describe the training to the ethics committees that you have that show that you're actually an appropriate person to conduct the research. But that does come in actually within one of the forms, so don't worry too much. So the latest version of the participant information sheet is available to you. I have sent those through so that you can have access to them. And the aim of it is to provide sufficient information in an understandable format and to support potential participants in making the right decision for them to take part in your study or to decline participation. And these are the key areas that are covered within the main template guidance. So think about your study title. Do make sure that it makes sense. I have seen a whole range of study titles. You can have a full title and a short title when you're going through the application to the Health Research Authority. So really make sure that they are both self-explanatory wherever possible. Provide an invitation and brief summary to your potential participants so that they just have enough information to decide whether they want to read further. And part of that information and brief summary should actually state that you are undertaking the study as an educational project, and then you can mention what project it is that you're doing, just so that they know right up front that you are actually doing it as an educational study. You need to explain what's involved for the participants and the purpose and the background to the research within that invitation. What would taking part involve for the participants? And that needs to be really everything that you need to do for, sort of with the participants, making sure that it's absolutely clear what their participation involves. Everything from, if you do a questionnaire and then you decide to do a questionnaire and an interview, that you would say what the format was of the process. So they would be given a questionnaire that could be anonymous, but then they may be invited to take part in an interview, or they may then also be invited to take part in a focus group. So you literally need to spell it out step by step of what their taking part will involve. And also, what are the possible benefits of taking part? Frequently there's no direct benefit to the participant, but a lot of people do benefit just from that opportunity of feeling that they're involved in a piece of research, and particularly if it's something that, if they're being interviewed, they do really like to feel they're doing their part. And so you can say that it is perfectly okay to say that, unfortunately there may not be any direct benefit to the participants, but it is hoped that through the development of the research that it may benefit participants in the future, depending on what the type of study is. But you do need to point out any possible disadvantages and risks of taking part, and that goes back again to, as I've mentioned before, if they're taking part in an interview and somebody should become upset or distressed, you do need to point out that that may happen, but that they will be allowed to stop and sort of gather their thoughts if they want to, and then continue if they want to. But if not, then that you will stop the interview and that they don't have to take part, and there's no detriment to them if they decide not to take part. And also, what happens when the study ends? That question has really generated through from clinical trials, where if somebody is on a drug therapy, they do need to be informed what will happen at the end of it and whether that drug treatment will stop. But that question has stayed purely because it is really good practice to let the participant know what happens when the study ends. And that includes even your dissemination, so how you're going to report that information either back to them as participants, or how it will be, written up and published, which is particularly relevant if you want to use direct quotations. So they do need that reassurance that if you are using direct quotations, that they will not be able to be identified from your study report that you will provide. It's also good to just provide a brief report for participants, which is generally left in a general area. Don't think that it's appropriate to then say you will contact people at the end and then send them a study report, because that means you've had to retain their personal information for the whole duration of the study. So we wouldn't advise that you do that. You do need to let them know that if they have any concerns or wish to complain, that they can do so. And if they wish to complain, they do need a neutral point. And generally, we advise that you provide the ethics administrator of the Faculty of Health ethics committee, so that they can actually contact them directly if they want to. Obviously, don't forget your details as the researcher and that of your supervisor. And also don't forget to say thank you at the end of the information sheet, which is just good practice. So another question has come through saying, I'm requesting students to be my participants. How can I give them face-to-face for the patient information sheet? Would this be via a gatekeeper, or is the patient information sheet or participant information sheet completed once they have consented? Basically, you can provide an information sheet via the gatekeeper, and then you can write details within the information sheet on how they can contact you as the researcher if they're interested in taking part. They don't complete the information sheet, they complete the consent form, so they do need to make sure they've understood the information sheet before they complete the consent form. But you do need to have that first point of contact to just hand out that information. But when you do meet with the participants, you do need to have a copy of the information sheet for them, just in case they haven't got their version with them, and so that you can supply them with another copy, because anyone taking part in research should have an information sheet that they can keep with them and a copy of their signed consent form. And the consent form is distinct, and it's very different from the information sheet. And I don't encourage the use of a combined effect where you've got part of the information form combined with the consent form, because that really is confusing. So please try and use the templates that I've sent through, which are really clear. Okay, so current guidance on taking part in research relating to the IRAS form. Again, this is sort of mentioning again about how long potential participants have to decide whether or not to take part. They do need time to consider it fully and what it means for them to actually take part in the research. And they should be able to ask these questions and reflect on whether they take part. They shouldn't be rushed into decisions. So really make sure that whatever you're doing, you've actually got ample time to go through the information sheet. And as I've said, if they haven't read it, you really should be reading it through to them, just to make sure. And you can do that really politely. And I've had to do it on numerous occasions. And I say, well, I do actually need to let you know exactly what the study involves, and I need to be happy that you do understand it. So I'm sorry, I will need to read it out. And hopefully it won't take you too long to sort of get through that. As I mentioned, there's no real fixed guidelines, and it should be sort of considered on its own merits, but some will take longer. Studies will take longer, and they will need more time to really decide whether they want to take part. And consent for short studies, such as questionnaire-based studies, could be obtained much more quickly. So these are all things that you need to consider on how much time you have, what your sample group is like, and where you will have access to them. And do also consider things about whether the subjects have got to travel a long distance to get to you, which is often quite common within the peninsula and the way that travel arrangements go. So do consider your participants and what is realistic. And equally, on balance, also your time and whether you've got to travel to go and see your participants and whether you've actually got the time to do that within your current remit. So make your study manageable because you're the one that has to get through it, and you need to be able to keep positive through the whole process. So do think about that. So I won't bother. The other thing is that, as I've mentioned before, about you don't necessarily need to give 24 hours, but most people generally have access to an information sheet and they can at least sleep on it and think about it till the next day. But don't feel that you've actually got to keep to that time. Another part that's relevant to that, I'm just going to stop again for a moment. Another question that's come through about using a questionnaire, and would an information sheet accompany it, or would the information be included in the questionnaire? Absolutely use your information sheet as the information sheet for your study, and it is irrelevant what you do, whether you are doing a questionnaire-based study or face-to-face interviews. People are entitled to information about your study to decide whether they want to take part or not. If you're doing a web-based one, it is more difficult, but it should be absolutely clear that one part of it is the information about the study and the other part is the questionnaire. The other thing you have to consider about merging information into a questionnaire is you need to make sure that participant has a separate information sheet about your study, and also when you're data collecting, you don't want your data collection to include all of the other information that goes along with your study. You can use Skype to use for an interview, but you do need to make sure again that you've checked with the IT guys that you're using the most secure mechanism to do that, and they will definitely help you with that. And it does happen, and it is, we're in this technological world, so we do have to be very forward thinking, and I would say, definitely if that's what you have as your means of doing it, then that's fine, but do check you are doing it in the right way. And you do need to make sure the university has approved it, purely because when you think about it, the university is covering your indemnity. So if anything goes wrong and you're using an inappropriate site, not that you would, then it's the university that has to pay for anything that goes wrong. Another question that has come through that is, if a patient attends the department where I work and may be eligible for my potential study, would I be allowed to approach them if the clinician had mentioned my study? The answer to that question is yes, but there are certain aspects that you do need to consider, which goes back to the sort of earlier part in the presentation about conflict of interest. So the thing is, if you know that patient that comes in and they're a regular patient, they will feel duty bound to help you do your research study. So what you have to do is make sure that you don't do anything that could be seen as coercive, that participant patient has that opportunity to make that decision for themselves over whether they take part in your study, but that information must be provided to them by somebody else. It can be a clinician, but it has to be someone that acts as the gatekeeper for you and your study. It depends, sometimes you've got a very, very unique patient group where they're, maybe a very hard to recruit to study, where there are only a few patients with a certain disease type, and you may only have a handful of patients that you could actually approach. So the ethics committees are understanding of that, but I think as long as you've explained it well enough, not only in your application to the ethical reviewers, but also in the way they've explained it in the information sheet, then it is possible. But it does need, sort of guidance through that process. So the things that you need to think about that affect the appropriate time to consent are the type of research involved, so whether it's a longer time is needed for complex interventional studies, or whether a cooling off period could be provided. The desire to avoid participants feeling coerced into taking part, which is just as we've been talking about now with your questions that have come through. And an influencing factor can be, who will take the consent. And so, as I said, often patients do feel duty bound to help you because they know you and they see you sort of every month or so in the clinic. So do think about those factors. And also the views and convenience and welfare of the participants. So consideration of the participants' rights to choose when they consent, and a desire to share information about research with their family or GP. And that, again, you do need to get consent to share any information about a participant with either a member of their family or their GP, and that's only if it's relevant to your study type. Also, the level of understanding of the participants. That can also depend on the complexity of the study and the information and the participant group that are taking part. But you should make your information sheet as clear as possible to understand. And usually, obviously, as a student, you wouldn't have access to things like translation costs, and they can be really expensive. But do be really thoughtful about how you say the type of participants that will take part in your study. It's really not appropriate now to put, I will not recruit anyone who cannot speak English, because there is a whole section in the Health Research Authority about language and exclusion, because even mentioning that now is actually disrespectful to the Welsh language. And if you were doing your study across the UK, you would have to translate your study into Welsh if you were recruiting participants in Wales. So all of these little things you have to think about. That's what I'm here for, to help you through this whole process. Another thing is obviously the setting for the research. For example, immediate consent is often required in places like A&E or emergency departments, and yet more time for consent is required if you're involving a vulnerable group where the patient has just been given bad news, or they are a vulnerable group by their disease group or their physical ability. So you do need to think about all those types of areas and where you're actually going to do it, and make sure that it's an appropriate setting for the research to take place. Also, the consideration of risk of harm, so including the potential for delay of instigation of treatment against possible benefits. It's unlikely that any of the studies you will do will actually delay treatment of a patient, and it certainly shouldn't be at the level that you will be doing your studies. But it are sort of areas that you need to be thinking about. If you are seeing a participant, say when they're coming in for their standard care, think about how much time it's going to take them to then take part in your study. And so you may be delaying them, and they may miss their bus home, and they may not have very regular buses or something like that. So think about all of those aspects and whether it's actually going to cause any sort of anxiety for your participants. And also other factors influencing the decision may include when screening to the study will take place, and the fact that more time may be given or may give more gravitas to the research. So you may need to do some screening, but that again is another difficult area, particularly if you're wanting to look at your own patient group that you may see on a regular basis. The screening part might need to be done again by the gatekeeper, so that is another factor to consider. And if it means looking at a database, you can't have that first point of contact. So looking at a database to select your patients is not appropriate at the level that you're doing your degree at. You would have to get somebody else to do that part for you, and then those participants would have to be contacted with information about your study so they can then contact you. Questionnaires in research, we've sort of touched on. Many projects can be wholly based on information within a questionnaire, and there are several really good reasons why questionnaires can form an important element in the research. They can be flexible, easy to apply, relatively inexpensive, and can be far-reaching. So you can use ones with open option boxes so that people can fill in text and put what they need to. And also choosing the questionnaire, as I've mentioned earlier, it may be a validated tool that is used for a particular type of study, but you may also need to devise one yourself, and really think about the way that you're phrasing your questions when you do that. And even popular, well-validated questionnaires can be misused, however, so do think about how you're going to be doing it. And I can provide more information if you need that. So confidentiality, general guidance is that the safe acquisition, storage and transmission of personal data are major ethical considerations, and there are also legal requirements in the Data Protection Act in 1998. And coming forward, that will also come through to the General Data Protection Regulation. And it is your responsibility as a researcher to ensure compliance with the legal requirements. The Ethics Committee cannot give a legal opinion, but its advice based on its experience may help you decide whether further legal advice may be necessary. And research conducted with patients, tissue or data identified through the NHS and NHS organisation will review the compliance of the arrangements described within the Data Protection Act and Codes of Practice. And similar responsibilities in relation to the Data Protection Act and Codes of Practice fall to local authorities and other care providers hosting research involving access to service user data. So it's not only if you're doing research in the NHS, if there are county councils involved, other local authorities, organisations, charitable organisations, you do still need to think about the data protection and confidentiality. And you should give full details of any plans to share any data with others, and particularly if it's identifiable. And hopefully none of you will be exporting your information outside the UK, and there are other factors that come into account then when I would need to obviously give you further guidance on that. So these are the 8 data protection principles. I will let you just have a moment to read those, but it does need to be fairly and lawfully processed for specified purposes, which is, as I said, don't just collect it for the hell of it because you think it's a good idea. It should be adequate, relevant and not excessive. It must be accurate and kept up to date, not kept for longer than necessary, and processed in accordance with the rights of the data subjects, and also protected by the appropriate security, which means the sort of practical and organisational arrangements within the area that you're collecting it, and also not transferred outside the European Economic Area without adequate protection. And the Caldecott principles, there used to be 6 of these, and they've now added a 7th, and they are very, very similar to the data protection principles. And the person that is in charge of the sort of area that this relates to is classed as a Caldecott guardian in the NHS. And if you are within the NHS, then you should get to know who your Caldecott guardian is, depending on where you are located and your trust. And they actually govern what happens to patient information within their organisation. But the newest principle that has been added is that the duty to share information can be as important as the duty to protect patient confidentiality. Now, an occasion when that might happen is if when you are doing an interview and you're speaking to your participant, they divulge something that is either to do with a criminal offence or some other matter. You actually have a duty to break that confidentiality and share that information with, either you have to go to a line manager, you can also seek advice through your supervisor, but ideally you will be dealing with the system that you are currently in and referring it to whichever regulatory authority it is that deals with such things. So whether that be the police or whether it's through something like the Nursing and Midwifery Council, if somebody identifies poor practice, then you do actually have a duty to share that information and break that confidentiality. And that's the only time that you would do that. But having said that, you must make that absolutely clear in your information sheet that that is what you are going to do should that occur. And so that people are fully informed that that is what will happen. So do be aware of that. So just a quick bit, I nearly finished. I will warn you now, you're getting excited, I'm sure. The thing that I do need to bring to your attention is this. It is the EU General Data Protection Regulation that is coming into force in next year. This will not be affected by Brexit or anything else. This is actually going to be a regulation that will come into force, and it really has a difference about the standard of consent. So I've only done a sort of couple of slides on this one because obviously I think it's probably going to be necessary for me to do a whole session about consent because of the way that things have changed. But the Data Protection Directive definition is any freely given specific and informed indication of his wishes by which the data subject signifies his agreement to personal data relating to him being processed has changed under the new definition to add the words that any freely given, specific, informed and unambiguous indication of the data subject's wishes by which he or she, by a statement or by a clear affirmative action, signifies agreement to the processing of personal data relating to him or her. So these are the key points. I've squeezed them into one slide, I'm afraid, just so that you can at least get a good overview of it, because there are, some very large documents that surround this Data Protection Act change, and it does have a huge change for organisations in that should they find that people within the organisation are not compliant with the GDPR, then organisations are going to be fined substantially, and the fine has gone up significantly from the one that is sort of currently in existence with the Data Protection Act. But the key new points are as follows, that, and this is relating to sort of consent, that it's unbundled, so consent requests must be separate from other terms and conditions. So if you're trying to get some context to this, thinking about the question that came through earlier about whether the information sheet is sort of a bit of a combined information and consent form, then absolutely not. Consent forms have to be completely separate and absolutely clear as to what you are asking that person to consent to. So consent should not be a precondition of signing up to a service unless necessary for that service. It should be active opt-in, so pre-ticked boxes are now invalid. And although this doesn't actually come into next year, I would suggest you start practicing it now, and you use the unticked opt-in boxes, so something like a signature box where they've just put initials, and some other similar active opt-in methods. It says it should be granular, so you give granular options to consent separately to different types of processing wherever it is appropriate. And it should be named, so we should now be naming the organisation, and any third parties who will be relying on consent. Even precisely defined categories of third-party organisations will not be acceptable under the new GDPR. So that means that within your consent, you will need to point out that the consent or their taking part in the study means that the information collected for the research study may need to be examined by regulatory authorities that may relate to either medical notes or just the data from that participant, but you will now have to stipulate that it will be the University of Plymouth or any other parties that will be connected to your study specifically, so any other third parties connected to your study, and it should be documented. So this is going to be fun to do. You should also now be keeping records to demonstrate what the individual has consented to, including what they were told and when and how they were consented. And this does mean that you literally keep notes of, it could be something like you met with the participant such and such a day, you spent 15-20 minutes going through the information sheet, you allowed them to ask questions, they asked questions, you answered their questions satisfactorily before asking them to sign the consent, they signed the consent and they were given a copy. And I think that's what they mean. I've heard this from the actual regulatory authorities that I am part of their consultation group. I now go up and meet with the Medical Research Council, who guide the Health Research Authority on a lot of their changes in documentation, and this is what they are advising. It should be easy to withdraw, so you must tell people that they have the right to withdraw their consent at any time. Now that was always the case, but you do also need to make sure that they know how to do it. It must be easy for them to withdraw, and as easy to withdraw as it was to give consent. And it means that you will have to have a simple and effective withdrawal mechanism in place. So that is something that you are probably going to have to spell out, sort of with your studies. Don't worry too much if, don't go to town on this with your sort of application as you're going through this year, but just bear this in mind that you know, we need to be thinking along these lines, because they have actually also spoken about the fact that some studies will be examined, and if they think that the information that was given or the way that the consents were used were inappropriate, they will ask people to reconsent participants. So it is just something that we need to be aware of. And also the last one, that there is no imbalance in the relationship. So consent will not be freely given if there is an imbalance in the relationship between the individual and the controller. This will make consent particularly difficult for public authorities and for employers who should look for an alternative lawful basis. Now, a similar thought around this is this conflict of interest. So there's a whole lot more information relating to this new GDPR regarding the controller, who is the controller and who is the processor. So these are all elements that are going to come into play, and all things we have to get used to, and hopefully we will gradually get used to it, and it won't just sort of be dropped on our heads and we have to just suddenly do it in a completely different way. But essentially it's not too bad, it's not too different to what we've already been doing or we should have been practicing, but it will mean that there will be changes afoot, and we do need to be prepared. So just a couple of slides here now on what is valid consent in brief, and this is just taken from some of the guidance they provide in their new documentation. So consent must be freely given. This means giving people genuine ongoing choice and control over how you use their data. So they may be able to come back to you at a later time and say that they want you to remove their data. Consent must be specifically cover the controller's name, the purposes of the processing, and the types of processing activity. And the consent request must be prominent, unbundled from other terms and conditions, concise and easy to understand, and user-friendly. And then also consent should be obvious and require a positive action to opt in. So as I've mentioned, either keeping with these initial boxes, which are what are currently used, and making sure that they really have that choice over whether they take part or not. And explicit consent must be expressly confirmed in words rather than by a positive action. So from that, I'm taking it that where we have taken it that returning a questionnaire is almost consenting to taking part, what we may need to do is include something that maybe just an initial box or some form of recording that they are happy to consent to take part in returning the questionnaire, or taking part in the research study by returning the questionnaire. But then thinking about that, they won't want you to do it as a tick box, so it does make it quite difficult. But we can work through this, and we will, sort of help with further information as it comes through. But the other thing is that there is no set time limit for consent, or how long it lasts will depend on the context, and you should review and refresh consent as appropriate. So just some very closing comments now. And the Research Ethics Committee review must ensure that the same protections for the safety, rights, dignity and well-being of participants are in place, whoever undertakes a particular research project. However, the National Research Ethics Service recognises that student research has significant educational value, including the training it provides for those who will go on to become professional researchers of the future. And I sincerely hope you do go on to do further research and are not put off by this at all, because I am here to help you and I want you to get through it. That it may be undertaken to tight academic deadlines and requires support if these are to be met. And this again is something I don't want you to be concerned about. We will support you through this. We have had a few researchers over the past few months, as the new HRA system has been bedding in, that have taken a long time to get through the application process and have actually had to sort of extend their deadlines. But I have supported 2 researchers so far by sending a sponsor's letter to say that I support their extension and that it has been unavoidable due to the process that they've had to get through. But it is improving, and the HRA are doing everything possible to speed up their reviewing processes. But don't feel that you're alone if you feel that you're getting a bit pushed. But all I can say is forward planning and do it as early as you can. And also that it may not necessarily be of the same scientific quality or importance as other professional research, though it may still contribute to the knowledge or indicate areas for further study. So what you are going to do is valuable. So do feel positive about it. Do a subject that you are interested in and passionate about, because that's what helps you get through the process. And although the ethics process can be a nightmare to some people, you will have support through it. So don't worry, and you're able to contact me whenever you need to. So what I would encourage you to do now is send any questions that you might have, and there are my contact details as well. And the presentation is available to you, and also the information sheet guidance, consent template guidance, some of my key tips as well. And then I did send a couple of guidance templates from the Health Research Authority about applying to them for staff-based studies and for non-commercial research. So hopefully that will be very helpful, and I look forward to receiving any questions that you have.
Okay, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed that session. There's a lot to think about. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop the presentation and obviously save the recording so it'll be uploaded later. And maybe you'd like to have a bit of time to think of any questions, or specific questions that you want to ask Pam this afternoon, and we'll be back at 1 o'clock. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, and see you at 1.